Shabbat Shalom, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. If you came here expecting a simple answer to what is misnamed a crisis on the United States southern border, you won't hear that from me. First of all, it's not a crisis. It's an unbelievable humanitarian disaster that will only get worse. I also want to lower your expectations, or fears for that matter, that today will see me launch into an anti-Trump tirade. You will not. I think other than a couple of passing references, President Trump's name rarely comes up. You will hear from me today what I felt on this trip. Often the raw emotion, the sadness, the humiliation, helplessness, anger that I felt on this trip. I speak today from this pulpit because this issue, I think, is a Jewish imperative, as you will see. I hear the prophetic voices of our people today, how our greatest prophets railed at the inhumanity they were witnessing, the mistreatment of life's most vulnerable, how it angered our prophets, and it should anger all of us. And just as for them, there was not one villain, there is not one villain here. My friends, we are all responsible. Migrants, asylum seekers coming from our southern border have been abused for decades by Democratic and Republican presidents and by both parties, and by a deafening silence by all of us. What we may be seeing today is cruelty on steroids, layer after layer after layer of unbelievable violations of human rights. And I will tell you briefly some of the stories of pain and heartbreak I heard and witnessed. But I want you to understand from the beginning that this has been going on for a long time, well before this administration. And the situation is far more complex and far more cruel than I ever imagined. And I am just as at fault for not knowing how bad and for not speaking up long ago. I told you last week about how I was fortunate enough to join this important mission with some amazing people. This mission to the Arizona-Mexico border, organized by the Jewish Council on Public Affairs. So I'm not going to go into that this morning. And I can't possibly cover everything that I witnessed, everything that I experienced. I have a full journal of notes, which I'm sure I will refer to in the months ahead. And I also want you to keep in mind that what we saw in Nogales is somewhat different than what might see in other border towns, like, say, McAllen, Texas. Understand that. But let me give you a little bit of how our tour unfolded. Let me give you some highlights and some personal reflections along the way, and then some initial takeaways. Our first stop on this mission to the Arizona-Mexico border was the Mexican Consulate General's office in Nogales, which is on the American side of the United States border as opposed to Nogales, Mexico. The Consul General and his staff described how Mexican immigration to the United States is actually very low. And it's really people from other countries who are trying to enter the United States from Mexico. And these people include folks from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Venezuela, Nicaragua, India, Poland, Russia. Now, spoiler alert, that's true. We met many of those people from different countries. The Consul General explained to us the metering system. What that means is that, as I understand it, all those who come to the border at a checkpoint and seek to claim asylum are given a number. And of course, the numbers of people continue to grow. But they're given a number and told to wait in Mexico for their number to be called. Now, this is not the Remain in Mexico policy that the Trump administration has tried to implement. By executive order, it was blocked, then restarted. But metering is different. Metering started, as I said, due to the massive number of people trying to come in legally, just to be heard. But the backlog of cases is so large now that the United States simply cannot even process their requests, let alone agree to hear their requests. So when you get to the border, you're given a number and told to wait for your number to be called. And most people's numbers are not called for at least 2 months. So I want you to think about that. Where do all those people go? Well, in the Tucson sector, where we were, you can guess. They are left at the border of Mexico, waiting just for their number to be called. Think about that. These people have nothing. They have no family in Nogales. They have no place to stay, no way to earn money for food. You can only imagine what this does to the community of Nogales, Mexico, and other places near border crossings. Think of the enormous pressure on the local communities to care for the influx of immigrants who seek shelter, who need food, who need work, not to mention the children right on our southern border. I would on this trip meet a nurse who is on call 24/7, Panchito. He has a daughter in the United States. He can't come to this country because he once crossed the border illegally. He is a nurse, and with his ambulance, which he built himself, he acts as a first responder. And he gets these desperate people left at the border with nothing, people who have sold and had to sell everything along the way just to get this far, who don't have, for example, insulin. All they have is a number. He gives them life-saving health checks, medicine if he can find it, and transports them, hopefully, to a safe shelter. Now, the Mexican government says they do their best, but I didn't see them doing much, especially for those who are from other countries. Panchito does. But the Consulate General did make a point that I think has to be noted early, and it stuck with all of us, and we continued to hear it throughout the trip, and indicated to me that the situation, and more importantly, the solutions, are going to be much more complicated than I imagined. And that this is a problem that predates the ugly Mexico is sending us their rapists, and well before build that wall. The Consul General's office explained that crossing into the United States through a legal point of entry is actually fairly standard. It's easy, it's not very challenging. But that's not the issue. What has happened is that we, the United States, down through the decades, created this torturous layered upon layered immigration system on our southern border based on the premise that anyone coming from the south is entering automatically, and we assume that they're criminals or illegal aliens meaning to do harm. That irrational fear has now translated into a situation that is bottlenecking everything, and is one of the reasons we see this problem growing exponentially each year. This did not begin under the Trump administration, but rather as far back as the Clinton administration, then further under President Bush, then even more so under President Obama, and has continued to grow even more cruel and vicious now. And now we are seeing a system fully exposed for the ugliness that it really is. I want you to think about it. In Nogales, there used to be just a short chain link fence separating Nogales, United States, and Nogales, Mexico. And people crossed the border all the time. But as we understood and we learned, in 1994, when a giant wall was put up on the border at Nogales and other points of entry, our southern border slowly was transformed from a place of welcome for two neighboring countries like Canada and the United States, with families on both sides and not at war. We've converted a situation where we have one Spanish-speaking country, Mexico, to the fifth largest Spanish-speaking country in the world, the United States, into this chaotic, militarized zone that stops not bad people, terrorists, from smuggling drugs, but rather inflicting vicious cruelty on the vast majority of desperate immigrants who, by any international metric, are refugees, asylum seekers, coming with either a clear and present danger to their lives, who are coming to work, to help their families survive, and those who are simply trying to be reunified with their families. We have always had a natural connection, an organic connection to the Latin American countries, but it has all been torn apart by decades of criminalizing our border for the wrong reason. Because the reason for people trying to enter our southern border have not changed through the years, but the push-pull factors that force people to risk everything are growing exponentially. As Jews, we can understand this, because like Europe during World War II and thereafter, Central America already is a humanitarian disaster, economically and politically. People are fleeing by the thousands, fearing violence and incarceration in their home countries for speaking out, or not being able to pay cartels, or corrupt government officials, or just want a chance to reunite with family in the United States or find temporary work. Many who cross in between ports of entry are also not criminals. They're even more desperate because they cannot wait the few months, whatever long it takes, to try to enter legally, which is why they risk life and limb to make the journey through the desert, where thousands of skeletal remains along the trail testify to that desperation. And yet I constantly talk about border security as if that's how it all began. It didn't. It started in the early to mid-90s. The first major takeaway from the Consulate General's office, and really from almost every speaker we heard from, was unexpected. Because what started all this? They all talked about the consequences of NAFTA and trying to stop immigration into the United States. It seems that as NAFTA was being implemented, the governments, Mexican government, for example, promised their people that the United States and Canada would start bringing factories over down to Mexico, which would bring good jobs, prosperity to our country. That's what they said. But in reality, the jobs often meant poor working conditions, slave wages, no benefits. People were developing cancer from the chemicals coming from the companies. Pollution from the plants was commonplace. They didn't have the same regulations. Meanwhile, in exchange for us getting cheaper goods, what did we do? We put up barriers, walls to keep Mexicans and others out, to stay and work on the other side of the border, to keep cheap labor force in Mexico, for example. So think about it. Our entire immigration system, which used to be under the domain of, you know which department? The Treasury Department. And then under the Labor Department. I mean, think about it. The reason it was there is because we wanted to make sure that we got our taxes from people that were working and that our workers were being treated well when they were in this country. And it went from those departments and slowly evolved, and it fell under the domain. Immigration fell under what department? The Department of Homeland Security. Really? We went from a country that valued Southern immigrants and migrant workers as taxpayers and potential workers that should be treated fairly into terrorists and criminals that we had to monitor through the Department of Homeland Security. Well, I have news for you. Before 9/11, how many terrorists passed through our southern border? 0. After 9/11, how many terrorists have passed through our southern border? 0. And yet, year after year, we have militarized our border, not to prevent drug smuggling. Most of those come through legal points of entry, but migrants from entering the United States, and ensure that they would have nowhere to work but the factories of Mexico and Central and South America. I mean, the people can't survive on the wages there. They can't feed their families. They lose their farms. And more of them then try to cross. And these are the people who have jobs, but they can't survive. What about those now in Venezuela, in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras, who have nothing? That was a major takeaway. So we went from our meeting with the Consul General's office to go into Mexico to visit a place called Jepac, which is a center that voluntarily tries to house migrants who had a number and are waiting for their cases to be heard. That's where Panchito takes people at the border and gets them there, hopefully. Jepac, Hogar de Esperanza y Paz, a place of hope and peace. Jepac provides migrants with food, with shelter, beds, education, computer skills, English lessons, and so much more. Now, this particular center was not upscale by any stretch of the imagination, but from what we were told, the one in Nogales, this one, was at least safe, was at least clean, and at least provided services. So unlike others, like in Tijuana, which are in areas where rape, violence, fear of death are a fact of life. And that doesn't include the many who don't make it to shelters and just end up in the streets fending for themselves, or in desperation try to enter in dangerous non-ports of entry. I mean, it was heartbreaking to meet so many of what we would call the lucky migrants at Jepac, waiting in limbo until a border agent calls their number. I mean, I spent time with a family from Cuba, which came through Venezuela, who have nothing. They're praying to Dios, they're praying to God that they will be allowed entry into this country. Another family with a small child from Venezuela who fled for their lives. I met a young woman from Nicaragua. Cuba has always been horrible, and Venezuela and Nicaragua have been challenging for quite some time, but now the situation in those three countries are unlivable. And as I talked to the parents, I saw my parents. I saw my parents a lot this trip. I realized that for them in Argentina, times were tough in the early 1960s, both politically and economically. But I was fortunate. They were fortunate that they had enough time and space to apply and bring me here safely. But I know, my folks, if the violence, the horror, and not poverty, but death in Buenos Aires, were what they were, in what we were hearing was being recounted, they would have taken these desperate journeys as well. So would you for your family. So would you. So would I. And you know what? So did our families down through history. Our Jewish families came in crowded boats, and many died along the way. They were desperate for safety for their families. When I saw those families, I realized why I need to talk about this from this pulpit. Because what I saw was the human story of migration. What I saw was the Jewish story of migration. Just like Abraham and Sarah, our first matriarch and patriarch. I mean, think about it. What is the first story told about Abraham and Sarah? They had to flee the land of Canaan. Why? Because it wasn't safe. There was a famine in Canaan, and they had to go to Egypt. My friends, what I heard at Epoch, those were our stories. Leaving place after place in search of a better world in the dangerous exile. I mean, I cried a lot on this trip. I teared up almost everywhere I went. I mean, there was so much to tell you about, but when Venezuelan immigrants with literally nothing were so excited that we came to be with them and express our solidarity, and they prepared for us some traditional Venezuelan food. I think it was called arepas. It was absolutely magnificent. I saw both the dignity and the strength of the human spirit. It echoed in my heart. But then I realized what we were being told by authorities, that less than 2% are going to be let into this country. And it broke my heart knowing that the people I saw, the people I talked to, the people I hugged, people who came with nothing, all they had was a number, are probably in the next few months going to be rejected and not going to enter the promised land. Just to tell you that the trip was not all heartbreaking, we did have one moment of levity. Our van driver locked his keys in the van. We had two vans, and a bunch of us, and I was in that van, found ourselves in Mexico without a ride home. And yeah, Mom, I waited until I got home to tell you that. We were able to take a taxi to the United States border down a rickety road, just like the ones Marilyn and I experienced in the West Bank a few years ago with Debbie Hill. We walked to the border patrol with the border crossing with our passports, got another taxi back to Tucson. About 25 miles in, we were pulled over by the Customs and Border Patrol checkpoint. I've never experienced the feeling of being pulled over and asked for identification and having my car searched in America. I mean, we were 25 miles in. We can talk later about the Fourth Amendment, how that doesn't always apply. We also had the opportunity to hear from several speakers, many with starkly different points of view. Some of our speakers were very emotional and often held back tears. Though if you saw the misery that we saw in just a couple of days, if you were them day after day seeing that for years, you would be holding back tears. You would be doing more than holding back tears. You would be crying, and you would be outraged, and you'd be angry. They understand, since they live there with great clarity, the humanitarian challenges that migrants face. Migrants face for simply crossing an international border to seek safety and a better life. That's their crime. And viewpoints and perspectives were different. For example, we had a thorough presentation from the United States Border Patrol Public Affairs Unit. They spoke about their efforts to prevent illegal crossings in the United States. They spoke about the humanitarian and medical aid they do provide for immigrants before sending them to other agencies to be processed. About their land, their sea, their air operations, their canine units to prevent drugs and human trafficking, and how their role has become even tougher because they have to monitor now between the points of entry. Again, migrants coming into the desert, almost half dead, who often need immediate attention. Now, the Border Patrol agents noted that 70% of the people caught are not asylum seekers by U.S. definition. They talked about how most people are fleeing their native countries for economic opportunities, but they know they would not have a chance of getting into the United States legally because some have been caught once, and once you've been caught, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to get a visa. The border agents believed that extending the wall further would make their jobs a lot easier because they wouldn't be as stretched out. And it would ultimately, in their opinion, add to the safety of those crossing the border, because if you enter through the dangerous non-points of entry, you go into the no man's land of the desert, where you likely only find death. So they truly believed that extending the border would save lives. We heard from folks from No Mas Muertes, no more deaths. They would follow the Border Patrol, and they would not even be in the same room with the Border Patrol agents. They pushed back on their narrative, and spoke of their work leaving water and food along the desert trails to aid people crossing. They echoed the words of Elie Wiesel that no human being should ever, ever be considered an illegal. We then went back the next day to Arizona, following the path of a person coming to America. They've got their number called, they've been processed, and now they're waiting for a hearing. And we visited the Casa Letha Welcome Center, a former juvenile detention center turned into a central facility for migrant parents and children who were released by Border Patrol after their numbers were called, and they're allowed to stay in America. They're given now a court date to make their case to stay. There we saw families who had just arrived and stepped foot into America. And they were given, thanks to this extraordinary organization, clothing, diapers, food, beds, showers, basic resources to function. There too, they also obtained ESL training while they figured out what their next steps would be. Now, I want you to think about it, because if this center and others like it didn't exist, these people would simply have been dropped off at a bus stop by Border Patrol. They don't know the language. They wouldn't know how to get to where they need to go, how they would prepare their case. They don't have the resources to get a lawyer, or how do you do that? So using private donations, Casa Letha helps them, teaches them how to find a lawyer, what papers they need to fill out, where they need to go. And yet, again, that realization, at the end of the process, we came to the realization that they and their children, after all they have done, will almost assuredly be sent back to what ghastly fate? At Casa Letha, we heard stories told in Spanish from a Bolivian woman named Rosita, who had things she couldn't even talk about, what was done to her along the way, who had then been manipulated to come to work in the United States for 6 months under false pretenses, and planned to return home after she made some money after her 6 months contract ended. She was told she'd be getting a ticket to go back home. And so she gave the person money to get here, found out there was no job, no ticket for her to get home. She needed to work. She needed to get a ticket back, but she was caught working illegally. So she was prosecuted, imprisoned, even though she was a victim of human trafficking. She ended up having a judge tell her that she could be released with a $20,000 bond, which is impossible for her. So she was imprisoned for about 18 months. I thought of my mom. She came in the 50s from Argentina to work temporarily, and how much different it was for her. If there was ever an example of how messed up our immigration system along our southern border is, Rosita's story is heartbreaking. And yet after all this time, imprisonment and suffering, Rosita is one of the lucky ones. We then went to the DeConcini Federal Courthouse to observe Operation Streamline at work. This criminal system, it's not an immigration court. It's an expedited hearing and sentencing for migrants arrested crossing points of entry, not like the ones in Casa Letha. And here's what we saw in that courthouse. We saw a large courtroom with rows of chairs in the middle, each one with migrants sitting on the chairs. Their shoelaces, their belts were removed from them. Each person was waist-chained handcuffs, and their legs were chained together as if they were the most violent criminals on earth. None of them spoke English, so they each were provided with a translation earpiece. There was one guy who could not speak Spanish or English. He spoke an indigenous language and couldn't understand what was going on in the trial, couldn't understand his lawyer. He had a first-grade education. The judge would call one full row up and ask them individually if they knowingly entered the United States on a specific date. Most had been caught within the last week. If they pled guilty, they would be given time served, they would be sent back, and because of their record will more than likely never ever be allowed to emigrate lawfully into the United States again. Each one of them pled guilty. Many, this was not their first violation, so they were sentenced for prison additionally for 30 to 180 days, depending on if this was their first, second offense. This whole trial was difficult to watch. We were watching a criminal court with state-provided defense attorneys who couldn't do anything to protect their clients. They literally had just met them maybe 45 minutes before the trial. After the proceedings were done, row by row, one of the lawyers finally spoke to us saying, this happens every single day, about 70, 75 people every single day. Again, I saw a young couple, and I apologize. I saw my parents constantly. It's a young couple, probably the same age as my parents who came to this country, but in shackles. And I heard the scraping of the chains on the floor. And their only crime, again, these are not drug smugglers. These are not violent, terrible people. These were human beings. They were human beings crossing a border to find one of what George Will says is 7 million jobs, low-paying jobs that we can't fill in this country. My friends, these were our ancestors. They were looking for a better life. And they'll find it here. I'm sorry. They would probably find a better life for them and their children. They would send money back to their families who are struggling, and they would create a better life for their kids. We then heard from an immigration rights expert, a panel who spoke about the problems in Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and the factors in Central America that are leading migrants to come to the United States in sheer numbers. One final encounter before we spent time talking to the Jewish community of Tucson and hearing from them on what they were seeing, what they were doing on the ground. We heard from Josh Garcia of the Tohono Ugam tribe, which is on the border of the United States-Mexico border. He described the problems of walls and barriers and how they're preventing his people from accessing their ancestral lands, which are important to them for various cultural reasons which we can understand. He also described the ecological impacts of the walls that they're going up, since many species will not be able to obtain the water they need to survive. He talked about the security cameras that have ripped apart their sense of dignity. My friends, this is what we are doing in the name of border security. This is what it has done to the people who are seeking safety. This is what is being done to that land and the indigenous people of the Southwest. So what's going on in my head these last few days as I process all of this? I have a lot of thoughts, as you can see. And as the new year begins and I look with anticipation next year to my trip to Guatemala, I leave you with some very brief reflections and takeaways, some of which I will be sharing in the months to come. I've already shared them in social media, and I will continue to work through. Number one, I know more than I did before coming to the border, and I am much more confused, discouraged, outraged, and angered by what is happening. Number two, I recognize now more than ever that this is a complex situation, complicated by the fact that most of us do not see what is happening on the ground. What we see on television, in the media, both left and right, is an incomplete picture. Number 3, this is not a crisis. This is a humanitarian disaster which is going to get worse before it gets worse. Number 4, our global policies and how we treat and work with our neighbors to the south is a very good part of why we find ourselves in this situation. Number 5, I learned that this is something that didn't start under this current administration. Number 6, but has continued in a much more vicious, inhumane, and immoral way. So my friends, what can we do? I kept reminding myself during this trip of the need to look for Niebuhr's proximate solutions to insolvable problems. Because this situation started long ago, and it requires a systematic approach with a lot of different issues that we have to address. We also need a political will that, as you can see in this country, we do not have. We also have to have an electorate that needs a better understanding of what's happening on the ground, but unfortunately is not interested in finding that understanding. In America, we can only speak in sound bites. Open borders, build that wall. But as we gathered at the end of our trip, the JCPA, which represents an umbrella organization of 125 Jewish communities and agencies, we all know and realize that we needed to act. And someone said something very beautiful. She said that during the month of Elul, every morning, the sounding of the shofar is sounded, and it calls us to act in the eyes of God. It's a clarion call. And she mentioned, and I felt as well, that I was sorry that I missed the shofar blowing. While I was away, I missed 4 days of the sounding of the shofar. But as she noticed and she noted, we did hear the sound of the shofar every day we were at the border. We heard the clarion call of action. I walked away seeing the absolute necessity on my part of educating both West Virginians and having conversations with members of Congress and leadership that crossing a border in search of freedom, that crossing a border in search of safety, that crossing a border in search of a better life cannot ever be considered a crime. I left knowing that I have a Jewish moral obligation to support the organizations that I saw that are trying to bring comfort, relief, and help to those who are coming in search of safety. And I need to highlight them and find ways to partner with our Jewish community and with faith communities around West Virginia to help them, to bring them here to speak and to raise funds for them as well. I left knowing that we need to elect officials who are not hostile to immigrants, who can speak about immigration with compassion and understanding, and people that can understand that militarizing a border is no way to even begin to address solving what will continue to be a humanitarian disaster on our very border. We need to be looking for leaders who understand the push-pull factors for why people are coming. Not because they want to. We didn't meet a single person who wanted to come to America. Nobody wants to leave your homeland. It's the only place that you know. It's the only place you can call home. The people we met have no choice because violence, economic catastrophe caused by both climate change and globalization has left indigenous people who want to stay in their home countries with no choice but to risk their lives for the chance at safety and freedom. As a Jew, they inspire me. As a Jew, I know I need to help. And as a Jew, and with our history as a migrant people, I know that it is my responsibility moving forward to speak up for those without a voice. My friends, we all do. And I end with a bumper sticker that I saw at the Tucson JCC. That bumper sticker read in Hebrew, Ze lo yigamer ad sheyidaber. This will not end until we speak up. This will not end until we speak up. Amen.